Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Our guest today is Dmitri Alperovitch. He is the co-founder and chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitical think tank in D.C. He's also a naturalized U.S. citizen who immigrated from Russia in 1994 and went on to become one of the world's foremost cybersecurity experts. He co-founded CrowdStrike, where he served as CTO, and he famously revealed the 2016 Russian intelligence hacking of the Democratic National Committee. He's the author of the national bestseller, World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century, and correctly predicted Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Dmitri, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's funny, before we came on, we were talking a little bit about Taiwan, which I certainly hope we can get into, but I first want to talk just in broad strokes about semiconductors. Critics often argue that recent export controls on advanced semiconductors have backfired. Rather than starving adversaries of critical technology, is there evidence that these restrictions have unintentionally accelerated their development and self-sufficiency?
No, I don't believe there's any evidence of that. In fact, I believe they're actually working. And they work even better if we were better at enforcement and were more extensive with these controls. So first of all, China did not, usually this conversation is about China, right? And preventing China from getting dominance in this critical area of technology. And China did not start their production of semiconductors or massive investments in this field in 2018 when the first export controls started to go up, or in 2022 when more of them came online. This began really in the early 2000s with the establishment of SMIC, the Chinese main semiconductor manufacturing company. And obviously in even earlier in the 1980s with the establishment of Huawei, which later went into the chips manufacturing and design phase. But particularly with Xi Jinping coming to power in 2012, he initiated massive investments in this field to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars, predating any even conversations about export controls to China, because at the time we were still in this, friendly partnership competition phase. President Obama in 2015 announced, standing next to Xi Jinping in the Rose Garden, that we welcome China's rise, right? A lot has changed in the last 11 years since that statement was made. But even in 2015, when Xi Jinping put together his China Made in China 2025 plan, he announced that independence in design and production of semiconductors was a critical national security priority for China. So predating any export controls, right? China did not need any incentives to focus on this area, and they had started on this long before. Now, let's talk about those export controls. So we started actually with equipment. During the first Trump administration, we realized that we have an incredible choke point in the West on equipment that is used to manufacture chips, and particularly the more advanced chips, because they're basically made in three countries. They're made in the U.S. There are three companies in the U.S. Primarily focused on this field: Applied Materials, Lam, and KLA. There are a couple of companies in Japan, Tokyo Electron being one of them, Nikon another, and one company that many people have heard of in Netherlands called ASML, that manufactures, the only company that manufactures extreme ultraviolet lithography. The other companies are focused on other parts of the manufacturing phase of semiconductors. But you need them all to actually manufacture chips, and particularly advanced chips. And the first controls started going in place on export, particularly of the EUV technology, to China in 2018. And since then, Chinese have been really stalled in their ability to get to the advanced nodes. They managed to get to 7 nanometers using really a known process, because TSMC, of course, the largest semiconductor manufacturing company in the world based in Taiwan, showed around that time, around 2019, that you could use the older generation of equipment called DUV, deep ultraviolet lithography, to manufacture 7 nanometer nodes. And about 5 years later, the Chinese got there as well, using the DUV technology that we're still allowing to be shipped to China. They've done some experiments at 5 nanometers, but nothing that has been, as far as we can tell, productionized or at any significant yield levels. And the same is true, by the way, at 7 nanometers. The yields are very, very bad with those process nodes, from what we're able to tell. But they can go to 3, they can go to 2, right? The latest cutting edge nodes, and with the UV technology, they're unlikely to make more progress on that. So those export controls have actually worked in largely being able to stymie China from producing advanced chips. They would work even better if we had stopped them from purchasing the GUV machines from ASML, because then they wouldn't even be able to manufacture 7 nanometers. But we were myopic and did not go far enough. And then with regards to restrictions on the chips themselves, and those started going into place under the Biden administration in 2022, particularly the more advanced compute chips, GPUs, that you can use for training and running inference on AI models, they have unequivocally worked, because we have statements literally from leading Chinese AI companies saying they're compute constrained, that the lack of sufficient chips in China is the biggest impediment that they face. Now, again, we were half-hearted in those efforts, because we said, well, we won't let you get the very advanced chips, the most advanced chips, cutting-edge chips, but we'll let you get one generation behind the so-called A100s and H20s and others from NVIDIA. And those are actually good enough in many cases. They're not as great as the Broadwells and the next generation of Rubin that's coming online from NVIDIA, but they're pretty good. And the leading Chinese AI models are actually running on those chips. In fact, when a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, everyone was freaking out about DeepSeek and the progress the Chinese have made, very few people actually bothered to read the paper that DeepSeek put out, saying that they basically train their models on NVIDIA A100s and H100s that had been allowed to be sold to China. If we hadn't sold those chips, they wouldn't have made as much progress. So those export controls have worked. They would work much, much better if we tighten them up, if we don't allow any GPU exports to China, if we don't allow any equipment export to China, and we would be much, much further ahead.
I want to jump in here just really quickly, Nathan. I want to sort of zoom out. I really appreciate the kind of elaborate, highly technical discussion you just provided for us. But if we're going to kind of really boil this down, would you say that it's true that sort of China's at parity or more advanced than the United States in sort of many of the areas connected to AIs except chips? And to the extent that the United States still has kind of, a kill switch on, China's progression on AI, it really is surrounding chips? Or is that too simple of an analysis?
No, look, to make advancements in AI, you basically need 4 things, right? You need talent, which China has plenty of, right? And they have lots of people, lots of smart people. So we can't stop that. You need energy, which frankly they have more of, because they have fewer restrictions on being able to put up nuclear power plants or coal power plants and the like. You need data, which they also have plenty of. Anyone can crawl the internet, so that's not a limitation. And the 4th one is you need compute. And this is the only thing that we do have a choke point on China, because today the United States is the one that designs almost all advanced GPUs, right? Whether it's NVIDIA, whether it's AMD, whether it's Google, whether it's Amazon, and increasingly Microsoft and Meta getting into the space as well. The design is all happening by American companies. And there's one company that manufactures all those chips, and that is TSMC. Now, there are experiments with Samsung in Korea, and Intel increasingly wants to get into this game as well. But effectively, right now, it's TSMC, and maybe soon a few more Western companies. So this is the choke point we have, the only choke point to curtail China's advancements and make sure that we remain in the lead. And why is it important for us to be in the lead? Well, 2 things. One, there's undeniable evidence that AI is going to transform virtually every aspect of our lives. But the first one, or one of the first ones that it's going to transform, is combat, is war, right? The military is one of the earliest adopters of AI. You've just had an announcement from the Department of War saying that they're adopting Grok. They're already using Gemini, and will be using all really leading edge models. It's not just for autonomy. It's transforming logistics. It's transforming how we train the force. It's transforming how we organize. Lots of applications. And the question is, do you want the Chinese military, the PLA, to benefit from those technologies, given that they are the primary adversary, as stated in the national security strategies of the United States, not just the last one, but really all of them since the 2017 strategy from the first Trump administration? I think the answer to that is no. And then outside of the military, do you want the Chinese economy and their manufacturing sector and their technology sector and all other areas to benefit from this technology more so than we benefit from it in the United States, and to better compete against us and to continue losing our market share to them? I don't think that's a good thing either, right? So I think preservation of our lead in AI is extraordinarily important for both national security and economic security. And we do have this choke point. It won't last forever because the Chinese will eventually figure this out. But as many years as we can get out of it to establish that lead, to establish the dominance of U.S. models, to establish the standardization on those U.S. models, the better off we are.
You spoke to how the U.S. was myopic and didn't go far enough, early enough. What else could we have done?
Well, I think, in 2018, when we started putting restrictions in place on EUV SML machines, we could have said, we'll put restrictions on all Western equipment. From Netherlands, from Japan, and the United States. None of that should be going to China, because why would we enable China to produce chips at any node sizes? How is that helpful to us? Because we know what they do. Aside from shipping it to their military, they also engage in dumping and try to use that tried-old playbook that has worked since the 1980s to subsidize industries, then engage in dumping to destroy Western competitors, and then establish dominance in market share. They have that now in critical minerals, and particularly in rare earths. They have it in solar. They have it increasingly in batteries and EVs and all sorts of energy applications. Why would we enable that in chips? Hugely myopic. And then on GPUs in 2022 and later in 2023, when the export controls came into place, the Biden administration had this policy articulated by then National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan of small yard, high fence, right? This idea that we're going to define a very, very small area of technology that we're going to restrict from being exported to China, have a high fence around it, but it's going to be very small and everything else is going to be allowed. I think that was myopic. I think we should have said, let's enlarge the yard, make the fence even higher. But why would we sell any compute to China, particularly GPU compute that can be used for inference or run or training of AI models? Any of them, right? Even if it's a generation behind what the U.S. companies use, because that will drive more efficiency from them. They'll figure this out, and even if it's slightly worse, they can open source these models and have the world use them, even if they're not as good as the frontier models from the US, which is exactly what's happening today, right? China is maybe 12 to 18 months behind because we've sold them those chips. They would be years behind if we hadn't.
Well, I just want to jump in here. I really, again, appreciate everything you're saying. And, I wonder whether in this kind of moment of rapid flux in the Western Hemisphere, you might be willing to go with me on a journey of analogies where we look at, the Western Hemisphere as perhaps the biggest yard, actually being a kind of physical space in which the United States establishes supply chains that are vital to the advancement of AI, right? Do you think that we could go there? And is there a kind of significance to these questions of trade and choke points if we establish those kind of secure supply chains over which we have, dominance in the Western Hemisphere?
Yeah, the Trump administration right now is trying to do this initiative they're calling Pax Silica. Jacob Hellberg from the State Department just announced it a few weeks ago. And basically, that's the idea, that you are going to build a coalition of Western and Middle Eastern countries for AI supply chains. Because we do have one problem with AI today in the US, and that is energy, right? We don't have enough energy. We don't have enough data centers. Energy costs are not inexpensive here. So it does make sense to partner with countries, for example, in the Middle East, where they have plenty of energy, maybe others as well, but making sure that there are strict controls on those data centers and the chips going into those data centers to make sure that Chinese companies can't get access to them, right? Because even if we're successful in blocking export of chips to China, if the Chinese companies can just rent space in global data centers to train and run their AI models, then it kind of defeats the purpose. So you want to make sure that they are not able to do that and use that loophole. But if you can do that, then it does make a whole lot of sense to bring partners closest to us and train models together and use that energy capacity and frankly other advantages like innovation that of talent that you can use in Europe and elsewhere to help accelerate Western dominance in the sector.
Can we simplify a little bit about the real world impacts of this AI race and chip war? So, what does it actually mean for everyday life and everyday Americans if China beats us or if we beat China in both a year and 5 years? I think to many people, this is something that's abstract. People have been scared of China for generations. Then it was the rise of the rest. Then it was, okay, China's our friend. Actually, they're not again. But what would it actually look like to how would it impact the lives of everyday Americans if we take these two paths? One, your approach, which is harder, versus they're going to get it inevitably. Who cares?
Yeah. Well, look, since 1945, we have enjoyed an incredible advantage that the United States military was the most powerful force on the planet, right? That was securing not just the national security of the United States and our territorial integrity, but also the trade routes that we use around the world as we import and export goods across the globe. If China wins the AI race, I think it would give them a huge leg up, first and foremost, militarily. And do we want to see the PLA becoming the world's preeminent military force? Because we see how they operate, right? Look at South China Sea. Look at East China Sea, where they bully countries like the Philippines, Japan, Taiwan, right, to try to enforce their will, right? They're a bully. And, some people will say, well, the United States bullies too. But, if you're coming at it from an American perspective, you want to have the strongest military. You want to be able to set the rules of the road for the rest of the world. And what we don't want to do is have China do that and bully our partners and allies around the world and dominate the sea routes that we use currently to ensure the economic security of the United States, right? So that's first and foremost. Secondly, because, by the way, the Pentagon, the White House calls China the pacing threat. As we speak, the United States military is preparing for a war with China. So do we want China to have the world's greatest military that could actually defeat us in a conflict, right? We would face pretty dire consequences should that happen. And secondly, do we want China to become the dominant economic power in the world? Today, the United States is still by far the largest economy. We're 25% larger in GDP terms, nominal GDP terms in China. At the current growth rates, which have fallen down to single digits, it's mathematically impossible for them to catch up to us in the foreseeable future. But AI could change all that, right? AI and the productivity improvements that they could get from that could dramatically accelerate their growth rates, given that they're engaging in non-market competition practices, engaging in dumping, engaging in theft of intellectual property, bribery of countries and companies around the world. It's very, very hard to compete when they also have really, really good technology, right? So do we want to lose market share around the world? Do we want our companies to be less competitive, right? We've seen what happens in industries, right? Telecom is a great example. We used to be the leader in telecom technologies in the 1990s. And then Huawei came online. They stole some intellectual property, as has been proven in some court cases. They've started using the support and subsidies from the Chinese Communist Party, including the bribery that they've engaged in around the world. And now much of the world is running on Huawei telecom infrastructure, and there's virtually no U.S. competitors that are left in that space, right? All those companies, Nortel in Canada and others in the U.S., have gone out of business or have shut down those divisions. And you've had that happen now in solar. You've had that happen until recently in critical minerals and many other areas. Do we want to see that across our entire manufacturing base, our entire technology base, right? Do we all want to use just Chinese-produced goods and technologies and be essentially beholden to them? And we see what happens when they corner market. They've done that just in the last year on rare earths, right? Where they have over 90% of the world's refining and processing capacity on rare earths. They started using that as a bully tactic, essentially, against us, against Japan, against other allies, to try to enforce their will. Imagine if they have even more power in all these other sectors. because of the advantages they're going to gain from AI. That's the world that I don't want to live in. I don't want other Americans to live in. And that's why it's so important to curtail China's advancements in AI.
You're pretty active on social media about this very issue, saying that AI is the most transformative advancement in the 21st century. If you were president for a week or a day, what specific actions would you take to make sure China cannot beat us? And are you so far pleased with the president's current approach in combating China?
Look, we've kind of been zigzagging on this policy. So when the president first came into office, he announced export controls on the H20 chips that the Biden administration had not blocked, these NVIDIA GPU chips, kind of an older generation. And then he reversed himself. And then just last month, he announced that he will allow sale of pre-advanced H200 chips, even better chips, to China. I think those policies have been a mistake. I think that we should not be selling any GPUs to China. We should be ramping up enforcements to make sure that they do not smuggle those GPUs from other countries, that they don't use GPUs in data centers around the world where we ship them, that we enforce strict KYC, know your customer rules in those data centers if they're going to receive our chips. And then on equipment, I would cut off all equipment. Any manufacturing equipment going from the United States, Netherlands, or Japan, which we can do, by the way, pretty easily because we have a powerful weapon in our arsenal called the Foreign Direct Product Rule, wielded by the Commerce Department, which basically says that any technology made anywhere in the world by any company in the world that has at least a certain amount of U.S. IP, U.S. content, we can enforce global restrictions on its export anywhere in the world. And basically SML and the Japanese companies all rely on U.S. technologies, on U.S. chips and other things. And we can basically tell them, you shall not sell to China. And by the way, you shall not maintain the existing machines that you've already sold to China. You will not resupply them with parts, do any sort of maintenance on those machines. And we can cut off at the knees the Chinese semiconductor manufacturing industry, which would benefit the Western sector, as we're trying to invest in the sector, right? We've authorized $52 billion in the last 4 years on the CHIPS Act, right, to invest in manufacturing here domestically. Those companies are not competitive with Chinese production because of the subsidies and the dumping that the Chinese are engaging in, right? So if we want that policy, that industrial policy to succeed, you have to make sure you're not also enabling your enemy. Like, why would we do that? Why would we essentially sell the equivalent of modern weapons, which are chips and equipment to make chips, to our primary adversary as defined in our consecutive and bipartisan national security strategies? It is just absolutely myopic and ridiculous that we're engaged in this behavior, right? During the Soviet Union, can you imagine having a public debate about whether we should sell supercomputers? Essentially, GPUs are the modern day supercomputers to the Soviet Union. You'd be laughed out of the room, right? Even though you could say, well, these companies need more money because, they could get access to the Warsaw Pact countries and invest more in R&D. And by the way, if we cut them off, they'll invest in their own production and R&D, and they're going to compete with us. I mean, same exact arguments could have been made, but no one in their right mind would have said that, right? And by the way, why stop there, right? If the same strategy applies to chips, why not say, well, we don't want the Chinese military industrial base to be so advanced, so why don't we sell them aircraft carriers? Why don't we sell them F-35s? Why don't we sell them, our advanced destroyers and other weapon systems so that they can get addicted to the American military tech stack, right? I mean, that is ridiculous, of course, but the same ridiculous argument has been made on chips that is not being challenged as much as it should be.
It is interesting. You see a lot of commentators saying that they can become addicted to our technology. And I find that to be, again, myopic is a word we keep coming to, but I think it hits in this moment. I want to talk a bit about Taiwan, and I would love to bring George in on this because he knows more about Taiwan than I do. But do you think how is China incentivized to deal with Taiwan right now? And just sort of underscore to our listeners the importance of Taiwan for this process. It's something people know about a little bit. Oh, Taiwan's important because of chips. But let's unpack this a bit. Why does Taiwan matter, and what will China do?
Yeah. Well, look, I think it's a mistake to reduce Taiwan to chips. Are they a critical component of the chip supply chain? Irreplaceable, really? Yes, absolutely. Right. TSMC, the world's largest semiconductor manufacturing company, is in Taiwan. They make 40% of all chips, period, over 90% of all advanced chips. And it's not just TSMC, it's the entire ecosystem that has been built in Taiwan, various small companies that are suppliers to TSMC, both in the design and manufacturing of equipment and chemicals and masks and photoresist. Like the whole chain is basically in Taiwan. And it's almost impossible to replicate that anywhere else because of the decades of investments they made in this field, the talent, the supply chain ecosystem that they've been built there. So, when people hear about fabs being built in Arizona, that's important. But it's important to also realize that all of those fabs, TSMC fabs in Arizona today, are absolutely dependent on Taiwan. Right? The process engineers that design these really complex 1,200 step processes to manufacture chips, they're all in Taiwan. And for the foreseeable future, that will remain to be the case. So that dependency will remain, even though there's fabs now in other countries. But beyond chips, Taiwan has always mattered to the United States, at least in the last 100 years or so. Right? General Douglas MacArthur in 1950 declared Taiwan an unsinkable aircraft carrier, right? Long before the age of chips or the age of computing. Why? Because of the strategic position of Taiwan and the strategic position of Taiwan in containing China primarily, right? So China faces huge geographic challenges, right? When it looks at the world, it sees itself completely contained by the United States military and our allies in the region. When it looks to its far east, it sees the Korean Peninsula, half of which is South Korea, with 28,000 American Army troops, some naval installations, some air bases, some radars, etc. Further down in that arc, you have the Japanese islands, where you have the headquarters of the U.S. Naval 7th Fleet, Marine Expeditionary Force on Okinawa, and a very, very capable Japanese self-defense forces, getting even more capable as time goes on, and they're investing more in their defense. On the other side of that arc, you have the Philippine Islands and South China Sea, where for the first time in 30 years, we're back. The United States military is back. We're getting access to 9 military bases on the island. The Marines are there training with the Filipino military forces, and also deploying the Typhoon intermediate range ballistic missile system that can hit China, and something that they're incredibly concerned about. And at the center of this arc, at the center of this first island chain, is Taiwan, the cork that keeps China bottled up, essentially at the intersection of East China Sea and South China Sea, viewed as an outpost of American power, right? So when China looks at this, China particularly as a country that is extremely dependent, more than anyone else in the world, on maritime supply chains, right? Because it imports so many of its raw materials and energy, whether it's oil and gas or iron ore from Australia and other places, via these sea-based lanes, or exports to much of the world. Their economy as dependent on exports as it's ever been. That's an incredibly insecure position to be in, to have your primary geopolitical adversary in the United States essentially controlling all the lines of communications in South China Sea and East China Sea, and at a moment's notice can blockade you basically at will, right? That's not a great position to be in, particularly if you're China that's not just feeling insecure about all of this, but also the China that believes that it is reemerging in the world as the world's preeminent superpower, that it feels like it has its historic right to be the world's preeminent power, because for much of human history, it had been one, right? It only really lost that mantle as the world's richest, most populous country in the 1700s with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, first to Great Britain and then to the United States. And they feel like, this century they're emerging as that number one power. Well, it's not a great feeling when you can be completely contained by the other power that you believe is declining. I don't believe that, by the way, but the Chinese are absolutely convinced of that the United States is declining.
Yeah, that really resonates with what I saw sort of growing up in the Pacific. My ancestors are from Central and Eastern Europe, and so the kind of Soviet version of the narrative you put forward, I think has a kind of parallel to what we've seen as China sort of tries to establish this greater and greater foothold in its own neighborhood. But I wonder in this mix of Taiwan producing kind of 63% of super valuable chips to the United States. What is the kind of future as we see the kind of Trump administration haggling how to deal with this inconvenient strategic reality that right up against China is this valuable strategic asset, and where do you think we're going in that regard?
Well, look, the Chinese have been wanting to take Taiwan and unify with Taiwan really since Mao. It's actually interesting because Mao was not originally obsessed with Taiwan as the Chinese leadership is now. In the 1930s, he said it doesn't really matter if Taiwan is a part of China. And the Taiwanese have had a very different history from mainland China. People sort of think that it's always been part of China. That's actually not the case. That's Chinese propaganda. There's actually never been a single moment in Chinese and Taiwanese history when whoever fully controlled China fully controlled Taiwan. Not one moment. In fact, if you were to make the case, which I'm not making, but if you were to make the case of, past ownership means a right to have a territory today, the only country in the world that could claim a right to have Taiwan is Japan. Because they are the only ones that fully controlled Taiwan from 1895 when they occupied it until 1945, the end of World War II, when they had to give it up and Chiang Kai-shek took Taiwan. Obviously, I'm not claiming that Japan should have Taiwan, but that past ownership that the Chinese are claiming is just absolute propaganda and a falsehood. But even as late as 1950s, Mao was saying, if the Taiwanese want to be independent, that's fine with me. That started to change over time as the United States military grew closer and closer to Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. We had, over 10,000 forces on the island up until 1979 when we withdrew recognition from Taiwan. So they started to view it more and more as a threat, and also as a rival China, right? That Taiwan claimed to be the Republic of China. That is still the official name of the nation. It had the UN security seat that is now given to China. Was given to China in the 1970s. So it was on the world claiming to be the China, right? So in many ways, for the Communist Party, that was an affront. It was basically an indication that the Civil War never really ended because Chiang Kai-shek was never really fully defeated by the communists. He was able to flee with 2 million of his forces across the Taiwan Strait to establish this rival China on Taiwan. So it became politically and symbolically more and more important over time. But every leader since Mao basically declared that unification is inevitable, but they were still not obsessed with it in the near term. Deng Xiaoping, that took over China after Mao's death, basically said, hide your strength, bide your time. Let's focus on economic rebuilding, which will lead to military rebuilding, and then we can look at Taiwan down the road, essentially what that meant, right? And by the way, no one at the time on the U.S. side or in other Western countries bothers asking, who are you hiding your strength from and what are you biding your time for? Right. In retrospect, it was very clear who this was aimed at, but we chose to ignore it and said, let's trade with them. In the 1980s, we're actually selling them military systems, believe it or not. Some of their advanced helicopters and other systems are based on reverse engineered designs of systems we had sold to them under the Reagan administration. It's just mind-boggling. We never learned those lessons, it seems like. Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012, and he completely appends this hide your strength, bide your time thing from Deng Xiaoping era. He basically, in effect, declares, not explicitly, but through his policies, that it's time to show off our strength and waste no time. And he says that the unification of Taiwan is an issue on which the entire rejuvenation of the Chinese nation that they've been so focused on is hinged on. And the original deadline for the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation was 2049, which would be the 100th year anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, the Communist China. I believe that he essentially, in his mind at least, moved that up to be much sooner, because in 2049, he's unlikely to be alive. He's in his 70s now, so or at least in power. So he wants that to happen on his watch. He wants to be a leader who's greater than Mao and accomplish the one thing that Mao couldn't do, which is take Taiwan. So he's accelerated that timeline dramatically. And we know, based on U.S. intelligence community assessments, that he's given the order for the PLA, for the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027, right, which is just a year away. Now, that deadline has been misinterpreted by many. It is not a deadline for invasion. It is a deadline to be ready to invade, right? And why did he give that deadline? Well, 2027 is an important year. First of all, it's going to be the 100th year anniversary of the establishment of the military, the PLA. So the PLA actually predates the establishment of the Communist State of China because it is not the military of the state. It is the military of the Communist Party, right? So when the Communist Party got established in the 1920s, they formed a military arm, which eventually became the PLA. So it's very symbolic to have an announcement in 2027 that we're now ready to invade Taiwan at moments of our choosing at a 100th anniversary of the establishment of the military. But it's also the year of his reelection, right? So he is almost certainly going to go up for an unprecedented fourth term as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party in 2027, which will be a 5-year term that will end in 2032. And in 2032, he'll be 79. In Chinese system, unlike the American system, perhaps, they don't tend to elect their leaders into their 80s. And who knows, by that point, mental acuities may diminish, health concerns can come up, etc. So I think very much in his mind, he's thinking this fourth term may very well be my last, and I may have to transition power. And I really, really want to do this on my watch. So I want to enter this term, he decided, with the ability to invade Taiwan. And I've given the order for the military to be ready. It doesn't mean I'm going to do it in 27. In fact, I think it's unlikely he'll do it in 27 or even 28. But sometime in that 5-year period, I want to have the option in my pocket to do this invasion. Like any leader, war for me is always a last resort. In fact, Clausewitz said, quoting Napoleon, that an aggressor is always peaceful and that they would like to take over their neighbors unopposed, right? It's always a preference to do things peacefully because war is unpredictable and who knows where it can lead. We've seen that in Ukraine in 2023, that a 1-week war is still going on 4 years later. We've just actually passed the anniversary grim anniversary of the war now lasting longer for Russia than their entire engagement in World War II. So you don't want to do that unless you have to. And in 2028, he's got a potential option because there's elections in Taiwan, presidential elections, and the elections into their parliament, the LY. And you have a high likelihood at this point that the opposition party, the KMT, which has turned into essentially China appeasement party, very, very pro-China party, is going to win those elections. They've been out of power now for 3 presidential terms. The ruling DPP party, which is very anti-China party, is unpopular. If economic conditions can continue to deteriorate, it's very likely that the opposition will win. And then Xi might have an opportunity, in his mind at least, that these folks, the KMT, will actually push the unification through peaceful means, and I don't need to invade. I don't think that's going to happen, but I think he's delusional enough to think so. In fact, there are indications that he is convinced that most of the time when he's want to unify with China, and it's just those traitors in the leadership in the DPP that are preventing this rejuvenation of the one China nation. That's not the case at all. About 5% of the Taiwanese population want unification with China. Tiny, tiny minority. Even most of the KMT is not interested in that, but I think he's convinced himself that that's not the case. So he's going to give them a chance, right? If they win, he may give them a couple years to try this out and push them and pressure them to move towards the unification. And if that doesn't happen, as I expect it won't, then in the early 2030s, before his term expires, he may very well move on Taiwan. So it's not imminent. It's not going to happen next year. I'm quite convinced of that. But next 4 years, 5 years, the risks are growing.
What would China need to see from the U.S. to feel more comfortable in trying to take Taiwan?
Well, this is the key dilemma for them, right? They could take Taiwan today if they were absolutely convinced without a shadow of a doubt that the United States would not intervene, right? Because the Taiwanese military is really not in the shape to defend the island. It could be, but unfortunately, over the last 46 years, they've atrophied dramatically. In 1979, right before they left, there was a highly capable military. Ever since then, they've been essentially in isolation. They haven't trained with us. We haven't had a single general officer until very recently even visit the island. They've only been able to buy weapons from us and pretty much no one else. So living in that isolation has really had a huge impact on them. They also, in the last 2 decades, have been delusional that engagement with China will deter any type of military action. So they were pursuing that policy until about 2016. And that meant less and less investment in their military. That started to get reversed in 2016 and accelerated since then, but they're still very, very far behind. But the one thing they can't be sure of is what is the U.S. going to do? Because officially we have a policy of ambiguity, which is we are not saying whether we will or will not defend Taiwan. And as long as there's even a small chance that we might intervene, then this becomes much, much harder for them, right? We have a lot of assets in the region, in Japan, in the Philippines, in Guam. They're not far from Taiwan. We have a lot of aircraft carriers, a lot of air assets, a lot of missiles. If we're in this war, then today I don't believe they can win. They're trying very hard to build up a capability to defeat us, but they're not quite there yet. So as long as they're not quite certain about what we're going to do, this presents a huge dilemma for them, right? And part of that dilemma is also, if you're China, you're going to move first. Do you strike the United States bases in the region to try to put us out of commission early, right? Do you try to do a sort of a repeat of Pearl Harbor, but at least on Okinawa and Guam, to disable those assets that are there? But of course, part of that dilemma is we know what happened with Pearl Harbor, right? It didn't knock us out of the war. It actually got us into the war. And Japan came to regret this a few years later. So that would be an enormous mistake for China, because if you want to ensure that the United States is in, yeah, go ahead and hit us in those bases, right? So from a military perspective, it might be advantageous to do a first strike, but from a political perspective, it could be an absolute disaster for them. So there's a lot of challenges that they face in confronting us. And certainly if they could get an assurance from the United States that do whatever you want with Taiwan, we're not going to intervene, that would embolden them massively.
Well, does China respect and fear President Trump? And I know we're running low on time, but how do they see Trump? And do they think he's a rational actor as well?
I think they're confused. I think they don't know what to think. You know, the last year has been very good for them, right? It ended way better than they expected, right? It started pretty bad, where he immediately on a first day in office started instituting tariffs on China, fentanyl tariffs and other things. And in May, we were basically in decoupling territory, right? The tariffs were so high that basically all trade for about a week completely ceased between the United States and China. Just remarkable situation, right? And we ended with a summit in South Korea in Busan, and this truce that is still in effect today, where most of the tariffs are gone or on pause, and we're trying to pursue engagement and deals again, right? So they're sort of like suffering from whiplash of what just happened here. Right. On one hand, you're calling us your primary adversary. On the other hand, President Trump is saying Xi Jinping is a good friend of mine. So they're totally confused. They're also looking at Venezuela and even our action in Iran and saying, oh, whoa, I thought this guy didn't like to use military force, wanted peace, and now he's changing regimes or attempting to change regimes in Latin America and maybe Middle East, and is way more pro using military force than we ever thought. I think they have no idea what to think. I think he's very unpredictable. And I actually think that contributes, and President Trump has said this, that he doesn't think that China will move on Taiwan on his watch. I think he's not wrong on that, because that unpredictability is absolutely playing in their minds of like, is this guy going to nuke us if we go on Taiwan? Like, Could be, who knows, right? So it's better to get past that. They're not ready anyway, despite the order to be ready. They're still quite a bit behind. 28, you got this potential of maybe peaceful unification if the right party wins in Taiwan. So let's just get through the Trump presidency, I think, is their thinking, and then see what happens with the next president, see what happens with Taiwan, and reevaluate in a few years.
George, I know we're quickly coming on time, and if you have a question, of course. But Dmitri, I have to ask, you helped start CrowdStrike. How secure are our systems in the United States today, and was the Verizon being shut down yesterday potentially a attack? I know that might sound conspiratorial, but it crossed my mind.
Well, look, Verizon said there was a software issue. I have no reason to doubt that, so it doesn't look like it was a cyber attack. But how vulnerable we are? Well, look, virtually all of our unclassified systems, whether in the government or the private sector, have been infiltrated by either the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, or the North Koreans, sometimes all four, over the last couple of decades. And the reality is that with enough time and effort and persistence, a capable cyber actor will be able to infiltrate any internet-connected device. That's just the reality. There's no impregnable security, right? So as we've just seen, when you have Delta Force trying to get on a foreign military base in another country and capture a leader, despite the Russian air defenses, Chinese radars, and Cuban security forces, you can still do it, right? If you have enough capabilities, enough time to plan, enough time to practice. And the same is true in cyber, that when you're facing very capable actors that are investing billions of dollars and years, literally years, of persistent effort to break into our hardest networks, they're going to be able to do it. There's just no way to stop them. And now it doesn't mean that they're going to be accomplishing their goals inside those networks. You can detect them, you can throw them out, but it's a constant, cat and mouse game. You always have to be on your toes. You have to have modern defenses. You have to have a highly capable defense team. And, we have a lack of talent in the country, in the government, in the private sector. So some of the top companies in the world, the Googles, the Amazons, and others are able to do better than others. But no one is immune, and it's always a continuous fight. So cyber is a contested domain.
Yeah. Well, Dmitri, you've generously given us more than 45 minutes of your time. For our listeners, where can they follow your work? And if you could tell us about Silverado, that'd be tremendous.
Yeah, Silverado is a nonprofit policy accelerator that I started to work on these issues, particularly around this confrontation that we're facing with China, to make sure that we win the tech race, to make sure that we win the military industrial defense sector base race against China. So we're working with government officials in the executive branch and legislative branch in the United States to try to advocate for policies that are going to benefit America and make us secure and hopefully deter war. Because, look, we don't want a war with China. Even if we win, it's going to be a horrible outcome for, loss of life, unlike any that we've suffered probably since World War II. For our military, economically, it'll be global depression level contraction of global GDP, just absolute disaster, right? So we want to deter this action, want to prevent them from taking Taiwan or moving on Taiwan. And the best way to do that is, as President Reagan has said and President Trump has reiterated, peace through strength, right? Making sure that we remain with the most capable defense force in the world, with the most capable industrial sector, technology sector that contributes to our military capabilities, and that we are on the offense against China in terms of preventing them from developing their own as much as we can, and leveraging our choke points as opposed to arming them, which is what we are doing at the moment.
Wonderful. Thank you again.
Thanks so much.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe, give us a review, and share with your friends. Until next time.